It was the summer of 2011 when the Roberts family from St. Louis, Missouri, embarked on what they thought would be a memorable family trip. The family consisted of 42-year-old Tom Roberts, his wife Helen, their 16-year-old daughter Emily, and their 10-year-old son, Jake. They were a deeply religious family, attending church every Sunday and firmly believing in both God and the supernatural. They had heard many ghost stories, but never once did they think that one day they would experience a horror of their own. It wasn't something they had planned, nor was it something they ever imagined would be a part of their lives. The Roberts family had received an invitation to a wedding in New Orleans. It was an event that Helen and Tom had been eagerly anticipating for months. A cousin of Tom's, Sarah, was getting married, and Tom, being close to his family, couldn't resist the opportunity to attend. The couple had always been fond of New Orleans, with its rich history, vibrant culture, and festive atmosphere. However, they had no direct flight from St. Louis to New Orleans, so they decided to take a flight to Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and rent a car to complete the remaining leg of the journey to New Orleans. On the morning of their trip, the family was filled with excitement. They boarded a flight from St. Louis and arrived in Baton Rouge by noon. Their taxi driver, a man named Jerry, was waiting for them at the airport. The family greeted him warmly and made their way to his taxi. Jerry, a middle-aged man with a friendly demeanor, had been hired by the wedding organizers to take out-of-town guests to New Orleans. The ride was supposed to take roughly 2 hours. The route from Baton Rouge to New Orleans was simple. It was mostly highway driving, cutting through small towns and lush stretches of the Louisiana countryside. The highway was relatively quiet, and the Roberts family relaxed as they traveled down the road, chatting about the wedding and catching up on family matters. After a couple of hours, they found themselves near a small town called Laplace. It was there, on the edge of a long stretch of highway, that the incident would occur, an event that would forever change their lives. As they drove through Laplace, the family realized they hadn't eaten anything since breakfast, and it was well into the afternoon. Tom asked Jerry if he could stop at a nearby rest stop or diner. Jerry agreed, and they pulled into a small diner that looked like it had been there for years. It was an old wooden building with faded signage and a few cars parked out front. The atmosphere was rustic, with the smell of cooking food wafting out of the open door. The Roberts family entered the diner, ready for a much-needed break. Inside, the diner was simple but cozy. There were a few patrons scattered around, mostly truck drivers and travelers. They ordered sandwiches and iced tea, taking their time to relax and refuel. After eating, they decided to wash their hands before continuing the journey. The diner didn't have a restroom, but the owner, a short, gruff man in his late 50s, directed them to a well located in the yard behind the diner. The well was an old-fashioned, hand-pumped structure, surrounded by weeds and wildflowers. Tom, not thinking twice, went over and began filling a bucket with water. Helen, Emily, and Jake followed suit, using the water to wash their hands and faces. It wasn't uncommon in rural areas to use wells for basic water needs, so the family thought nothing of it. After they finished, they climbed back into the taxi and resumed their journey to New Orleans. The road ahead was long and isolated. The vast stretches of highway seemed endless, with little sign of civilization. The sun was high in the sky, beating down on the car, and the air was thick with the humidity of the Louisiana summer. The family gazed out the windows, enjoying the quiet serenity of the road. Tom drove, with Helen sitting beside him, while Emily and Jake sat quietly in the back seat. As they drove, the atmosphere inside the car began to shift. Out of nowhere, the family began to hear a faint sound, a soft, high-pitched cry. It was almost like the sound of a baby or a small child crying. At first, they thought it was just the noise of the wind or the sound of a nearby radio station, but the sound didn't go away. It was constant, recurring at regular intervals, almost as if someone was crying right next to them. Confused, Tom turned to Helen, asking, "Do you hear that? It sounds like a child crying." Helen, equally puzzled, nodded. Yes, I hear it too, but there's no baby here. They all turned to Jerry, the driver, to see if he had any idea where the sound was coming from. But Jerry, who had been driving quietly up until this point, seemed unbothered. It's probably nothing, he said, his voice calm. Sometimes you hear strange things when you're on the road. It's probably just the wind or a car behind us. But the crying didn't stop. It seemed to come from inside the car, echoing in their ears. It was faint but unmistakable. The family sat in stunned silence, trying to process what was happening. After a few minutes, the cry grew louder, more desperate. It sounded like a child in pain, and it was growing more unsettling with each passing second. "Jerry, do you hear that?" Tom asked, his voice tight with anxiety. "I don't know what you're talking about," Jerry replied, sounding distant, almost defensive. "There's nothing here." But the family could all hear it, the crying. It was coming from somewhere in the car. The sound seemed to echo from the back seat, then fade and return again. It was persistent, unrelenting. After several more minutes of hearing the cry, Tom couldn't ignore it any longer. "Stop the car, Jerry," he demanded, his voice firm. "Stop the car right now." Jerry pulled over to the side of the road, and the family climbed out. They checked the back seat, but there was no sign of any child or anyone else. The sound of crying had stopped the moment they'd stopped the car. But something still felt off. The air around them seemed heavy, thick with an eerie presence. Tom's instincts were on high alert, and he could feel the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. "What's going on, Jerry?" Helen asked, her voice shaky. "Where is this noise coming from? There's no one in the car." Jerry hesitated, his face growing pale. "I didn't want to tell you this," he finally said, his voice low. "But that well we stopped it earlier. It's cursed." The family stared at him, trying to comprehend what he was saying. "Cursed? What are you talking about?" Tom demanded. Jerry sighed, his eyes darting nervously to the side of the highway. "That well, it's been a source of strange happenings for years. Locals talk about it. They say that anyone who drinks from it or washes their hands in it is cursed. There's a spirit there, a restless soul that clings to people. It's been known to cause accidents, and some say it can even possess those who come into contact with it." The family was stunned. They had heard ghost stories before, but this was beyond anything they had ever imagined. They had just washed their hands and faces with water from that well. Was this the reason they were hearing the child's cry? Was the spirit attached to them? "I think something's followed us," Jerry continued, his voice trembling. "I don't know what it is, but it's not something you want to mess with." Tom, trying to hold on to his composure, spoke to Jerry with urgency. "What can we do to get rid of it? Is there any way to stop this?" Jerry nodded. "There's a temple not far from here. People say if you go there and pray, the curse will be lifted. It's the only way to get rid of whatever has attached itself to you." Without any other options, Tom agreed to take Jerry's advice. They quickly got back into the car, and Jerry drove them to the temple. It was located in a small town, far off the beaten path. When they arrived, the temple was quiet, its ornate design casting a calming shadow over the group. The family went inside, hoping to find some peace. The temple priest welcomed them and listened to their story. After hearing their account, he led them in a ritual to cleanse them of the curse. They prayed together, the priest chanting words of protection. The family felt the heavy weight in the air begin to lift, and for the first time since the crying had started, they felt a sense of relief. After the ritual, they climbed back into the car, hoping that the worst was behind them. For the next few minutes, they drove in silence, still shaken by the events that had unfolded. The cry never returned. As they made their way back to New Orleans, everything seemed to go back to normal. They arrived at the wedding, attended the festivities, and returned to Baton Rouge without further incident. But the memory of that cursed well and the crying child stayed with them, haunting their thoughts. When they finally made it back to St. Louis, everything seemed to be over. The family tried to go back to their routine, but the incident never left their minds. It was only a few days later when Tom read a newspaper article that shook him to the core. The headline read, "Child found dead in taxi. Driver arrested for kidnapping." The article described a tragic story of a child who had been kidnapped by a taxi driver and locked in the trunk of the car. The child's desperate cries were heard by the Roberts family during their journey, cries they had mistaken for a ghostly sound. The taxi driver, Jerry, had been responsible for the child's death. He had planned to hold the child for ransom, but when the police traced him, they discovered that the child had been drugged and left to die in the trunk during the trip. Tom sat in stunned silence, the realization dawning on him. The cries they had heard had not been from a ghost. They had been the desperate cries of an innocent child, and they had unknowingly driven right past the child's final moments, never realizing the truth until it was too late. In the end, the Roberts family could never undo the mistake they had made. The driver was arrested, but the guilt lingered. They had believed in the superstition, and in doing so, they had failed to recognize the real horror they had been driving with all along.